Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to connect with you and see everybody. And we've got a lot to talk about today. But I did want to just update you on a couple of things that I had a chance to do this week. I made two trips to Northern Kentucky, actually, one to visit Fort Thomas, and then last night to a school in Boone County. And then last week I was in Shelby County visiting their schools. So I've really enjoyed getting to see our students and our teachers and families and elbow bump, fist bump, and say hi in person. We are restoring those meetings, and I want to get out and visit several school districts around the state. So if any of you'd like for me to visit your district, please shoot me an email. We'll work to get that on the schedule and work to get that in place. But look forward to getting to meet all of you or see all of you in person and see some of your schools as well. We've got a couple of big pieces of legislation that we want to get some feedback from you on. One of those is Senate Bill 128, the supplemental year. We want to hear how that's going, what questions are still out there, what complexities you're running into in implementing this, and see if we can hear any concerns that are out there, provide any guidance or any information. Of course, we haven't put forth any regulations around this, so what we've put forth is merely non-regulatory guidance. So the interpretation of it and how it works is largely up to school districts, but we have tried to think through what implications districts will run into as they put this into place and how you can avoid some of the pitfalls that at least we could anticipate. The other is House Bill 563. Of course, that's the school choice bill, the omnibus school choice bill. It had two major parts, one of which was in public school choice or inter-district school choice. We've got some time to think about implementation of that and how that might operate. I think the legislature left open the door that there could be changes or improvements to this as we work toward implementation of it. One of the more controversial aspects of it is that it charged the Department of Education to devise some mechanisms by which the local share would also move with the student. And so we have to do that work. It's almost certain that whatever we come up with is going to be litigated. So that'll be part of the work that we do is thinking through how can we recommend something for the legislature that possibly could survive a court challenge. But we expect whatever it is, it's going to be challenged. And then the other part of that was the tax credits component that creates these account granting organizations that flow tax credits to any number of different private educational organizations, including private schools. We've been less involved on that side. Really, KDE has no regulatory or oversight responsibility over it. And honestly, we didn't want to have any responsibility over it. That's going to the Department of Revenue, and we've directed questions to them to sort out. But if any of you have thoughts or opinions on that, we're happy to gather those and share them with Revenue or any improvements that you'd like to make sure that we collect just going into the next legislative session again. So those are the two major areas that we thought we could get some feedback and input from you. I know that they're contentious, controversial, but sometimes those are the best things to talk about. We need to be talking about those things that are on people's minds that they're concerned about. We also have time for just open discussion. Some of you may want to talk about the American Rescue Plan funds and what your thinking is on that and how the department could help or support the efforts that you have or plans that you have about that. That's evolving as well. Of course, most of that money is flowing to districts, but there's a set aside portion that's staying at the state level. We've got some ideas around that, but we'd love to have your input and feedback on what we can do from the state level with the portion that we're able to hold back, the 10% portion. So with that, I think I'll turn things over to Natasha for the roll call, and then we've got Chuck Truesdale, our Director of Government Relations, and Meredith Brewer, our Director of Education Policy, on to walk you through the supplemental school year bill and or legislation now, and the House Bill 563, the Omnibus School Choice Statute. So Natasha, let's turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Just really quickly here before I begin with roll call, this meeting must comply with the Open Meetings Act, and accordingly, all the members of the Superintendent's Advisory Council must ensure that your video is streaming and that you can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting and not just when you're speaking. So all of you have done a very good job of that already, so thank you for that. Please remember that when you're not speaking to remain on mute, but also note that this meeting is being broadcast live, and so it is important that when you're speaking that you unmute so that everyone can hear what it is that you have to offer. So without further ado, I'll take roll. I'll do it the same as before. I'll go in alphabetical order by last name, beginning with Superintendent Atkins.
Danny Atkins, here.
Casey Allen.
Casey Allen is here.
Deanna Ashby.
Deanna Ashby, here.
Doug Bennett. Robin Cochran. Tom Cochran.
Tom Cochran, here.
Kay Dixon. Cornelius Faulkner.
Cornelius Faulkner, here.
Scott Hawkins.
Scott Hawkins, here.
Sanford Holbrook. Mark Kopp.
Mark Kopp, here.
Mike LaFavors.
Mike LaFavors, here.
Kyle Lively. Danny Osborne.
Danny Osborne, here.
Marty Polio.
Marty Polio, here.
Matt Robbins.
Matt Robbins, here.
Wayne Roberts. David Rust.
David Rust is here.
Greg Schultz. Trace Settle.
Here.
Jay Simmons.
Here.
Rob Smith. Kelly Sprinkles.
Kelly Sprinkles, here.
And Henry Webb. Have I inadvertently left anyone out before we move forward?
Natasha Robin Cochran is here.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Thank you so much. All right, that is it for roll call. I'll turn it back over to you, Commissioner.
Thanks, Natasha. Let's go right to Chuck and Meredith. I see that they are on. Let's turn it over to both of you. Let's start with Senate Bill 128, the supplemental year. And Chuck and Meredith, if you can give us an overview of the major components. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. These folks are living it in real time. But jump right into some of the feedback and complexity that folks are running into as we move toward implementation of this.
Sure.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. We do have a quick overview PowerPoint that Natasha is going to pull up for us.
And I think Dr. Glass already covered the bulk of it. We'll get into a few more details here on the slideshow, but we'll move fairly quickly so we can get to your questions and answers, because I think that's where we'll really get into the meat of this. So next slide, please. We're going to start off, as Dr. Glass said, with Senate Bill 128. And just so everybody knows, you should already have access to our guidance and our FAQ document. Next slide, please. So first you need to know the timeline, and obviously you should have already gotten all your requests from students by May 1st. Districts have until June 1st for your board to disapprove or approve all students. And once again, that is an all or nothing, thumbs up, thumbs down decision. It cannot be done on an individual basis. And you have to submit your assurance document along with any waiver requests to the State Board of Education by June 16th. KDE will be distributing a form to complete that, and I believe that is next week when they will be getting access to that, Meredith?
That's correct. So May 17th, that form will be available through the GMAP system.
Okay. Next slide, please.
So an important part of 128 is that all students participating in the program are still required to participate in the end of year assessments for the grade in which they are enrolled, even if they have taken that assessment the year prior. And students who repeat a high school year will be counted as graduating in the 5-year accountability. So that is something that I know is a concern for many of you. And so happy to address that in any questions that you have.
So when it comes to state funding, all of these program participants, including graduated seniors, will be counted in SEEK. Obviously, students who would have gone from, say, freshman year to sophomore year would have already been part of your SEEK count, but normally graduated seniors would not be. But under Senate Bill 128, they will be included in your SEEK count with one substantial caveat, and that is that graduated seniors have to complete each semester. For their ADA for the days in that semester to be counted. So for example, if you have a student who is, say, on the golf team and competes in regionals or the state tournament, and then once they've gotten what they wanted out of that senior year, they've already gotten their diploma and they leave, you don't get any funding for that student for that semester. Conversely, let's say they're on the basketball team and they attend the entire fall semester and then part of the spring semester, but once the Sweet 16's over, again, they've gotten their experience and they're done. You would get the ADA funding for the fall semester because they completed that semester, but not the spring semester. And of course, this SEEK is a 1-year lag program, so this will impact your SEEK payments for the 22-23 school year. And then also, ESSER 2 or 3 funding may be used, as long as it accommodates federal guidance, for this program. Next slide, please.
So it is important to point out that the bill as drafted does not allow any waiving of any statute. And we have referenced here that any student who has met all graduation requirements shall be issued a diploma. So once students have met the state and local requirements for graduation, they need to be counted as graduating. Those transcripts are locked upon graduation. So if you have any graduating seniors, so class of 2021 students who are electing to participate in that 1-year graduated seniors program, their grades will not impact their high school GPA. That will be locked because they have been issued a diploma. Each local school district is able to determine how grades for students in the program who have not yet graduated will be counted on their transcript. And there will be some support from the department about different ways that you can note that in the transcript. And it is important as well for those just that 1-year graduated seniors program that the law does allow for, that those students are not eligible for dual credit or work ready scholarships. They would be considered dual enrolled. And
one point that I want to sort of as the bridge between these two slides is that the graduated senior program is for this next year only. So current seniors this year could do the graduated senior program next year, but students who actually get a diploma in the future would not be allowed to continue and be included in your seat count going forward. So the courses that students take next year should be a repeat of the courses they took this year, if necessary and useful, or have a reasonable connection to the courses they took this year. The district will be the judge and the arbiter of what is a reasonable connection. We are not going to be micromanaging you on that, but we do expect districts to do what's in the best interest of the students. However, if a student does take a course a second time, for instance, if they take Algebra 2 and they got a C last year, they take it again and they get an A, they will get 1 credit toward graduation. And that is it. You can use the higher grade for the GPA, but they do not get 2 math credits. They do not get 1 math credit and 1 elective. They get 1 credit total for taking that 1 course with the same course ID. And again, the early graduation program has not changed. So we've gotten some questions about this. If you have a student who decides to take part, but then they subsequently get enough credits to graduate in 4 years after all, that is not an early graduate. The early graduation program has very specific guidelines, and those have to be met to get the credit for that program. Next slide, please.
So it is important to note that IDEA funds cannot be used for a student once they turn 22. And so that is something that districts should consider. Participation in the program is voluntary, and that it cannot be made mandatory to provide compensatory ed. And homeless and foster care students still have a right to attend their school of origin, and English learners must have equal access. So those of you who have had a chance to review those assurance statements, many of those are captured in the points that we're making here today. So when you are submitting in GMAP, if your district has elected to participate, you will notice that we are asking that you assure that these expectations are going to be met.
Next slide. Along those same lines, gifted students still have to have access to those programs, even if they are taking part in SSYP. And finally, districts should take into account the impact of this program on individual education plans, 504s. So the ARC committee may need to review those just to make sure that they comport with SSYP if the student chooses to take part in that. Next slide.
So SB 128 does not apply to preschool. We have received some questions about that, and so the program does not include students in preschool. I believe so. Dr. Glass, would you like us to stop and entertain questions before we move on to 563?
Yeah, let's do that. So I'd really be interested to hear what situations you're running into in your school districts that are sometimes outside of what the legislation contemplated or thought would happen, or what the department was able to think about what happened. I think this is where it really gets interesting, is when we start implementing, we run into all sorts of individual circumstances and situations that cause us to pause and think about what's the right thing to do. So we'll be interested in hearing some of those in your communities that you're experiencing, and then any advice or direction that you would have for us at the department on how best to handle those.
I cannot believe we've got a group of superintendents with no questions about Senate Bill 128.
Smooth sailing, Chuck. All the
birthday.
questions have been answered.
I would ask if Associate Commissioner Sims is on. I know that there have been a lot of questions about the impact on graduation rate. So if she could speak to sort of the federal expectations that we are bound to about reporting of graduation, and thoughts that we have had about that process.
Sure, Meredith, be happy to do that. Good to be with you this afternoon. We've gotten a number of questions around, can you remove students from the cohort? Can we simply do a in advance exemption sort of process, or take them out of the cohort? And federally, we cannot do that. There's very prescribed rules about when students enter and exit the cohort to end up being reported for 4-year and 5-year cohort graduation. So since we cannot take students out in advance, the question becomes then, is there ways to mitigate any negative impact on accountability, because your graduation rate could be lower? And obviously this is more a concern if you are a small school with small numbers of graduates, but a significant number coming back to take advantage of the supplemental year. So the staff and the Office of Assessment Accountability, we've been looking at kind of what exists in statute and in regulation. We've been working with the legal office, and we believe that we would be able to use the appeal process. That's not been used very frequently, but it is in statute, is also in, there's some references in regulation, and it allows a school to basically say that if their performance judgment, sort of their status and accountability, either state or particularly CSI 2 at the federal level, if that has been received because of circumstances beyond their control, and there's a list of other reasons or justifications for an appeal, then we could go through an appeal process, and then that goes to the Kentucky board for It goes through a committee first, and then I think on to the Board of Education. So we think we could utilize this. Now, what it doesn't do, it's not something that can be done in advance of the year. I know superintendents would feel better if just right now and this week we could say, here's how to handle these students, and you don't have to worry about a potential impact. We really will have to wait until the next year is over and we start to report graduation rates before we can apply the appeal. And before we run all of the data. Remember, this year we're not doing any accountability. So this is an issue for next year's reporting. So that's our thinking, at best thinking at this point, that we think we can use the appeal to at least mitigate any impact into the accountability system. But it will, we will need to calculate a graduation rate. And a key to all of this is students have to be entered correctly into Infinite Campus, because we have to be able to show evidence that the students who took advantage of the supplemental year have in turn caused your graduation rate to go down, to be lowered. And obviously the mark for Kentucky is below 80, is where we say that CSI2 kicks in. So I'll pause there. That might have been more detail than you needed, but that's the kind of question we've been getting from a couple of districts out there. So I just want to share that detail with everyone.
Let's see, Mark Kopp has his hand up. Mark, go right ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Rhonda and Meredith, for all that information. Really appreciate it. I think the reason, and I'm not going to speak for all my colleagues, but I think we're kind of quiet because we have heard a lot about this, and we've been talking about it, and frankly, just feel a little beat down from all of it. So, but having said that, I have a comment and then a question. It really does seem to be that this was a 2-page piece of legislation that when we did receive this 11-page guidance document, it really seems like that the department has kind of had to, and maybe it is had to, take a stance that a lot of the things that are in this guidance are very punitive to students and to districts. And so, we're looking for the optimism here, and our Board of Education has already approved the supplemental year for all of the students that do wish to take it, because they do see it as an opportunity for students. And frankly, they would feel, and their comments on this were, how could we not vote for this because of the fact that it is providing an opportunity for students that need it? But then we also have to mitigate that with all of the stuff that comes with it. So my question then becomes, how much flexibility do we have in the policy-making process? Because we've been told by KSBA not to create policies that are specific to this COVID pandemic. But how much flexibility do we have in our policymaking process to help mitigate some of the punitive, and as I'm just using that word myself, some of the punitive things towards districts and schools? And I'll be quiet and listen. Thank you.
Mark, can you describe what you mean by punitive things that are in the guidance?
Well, mainly what we just talked about with graduation rate. And I know that's a federal issue.
Sure.
We also see this issue as not being able to attain credit for a class. Even if it's not, the great example that you gave was the Algebra 1 class, a C one year and an A the next year. Even being able to award an elective credit, because again, we're not rewarding the work that student did to bring that grade up. We're just, it's kind of a, so, and that maybe that's too harsh of a term, and I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just trying to figure out how much flexibility we have with our policy making so that we can look at some of those things.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that first and then turn it over to Chuck and Meredith, who really have done a lot of work trying to sort out this bill. So I think one of the problems that we saw with this legislation early on, we don't fault its intent or what it was about. It's to try and create opportunities for students that missed out on a lot this past year. And to allow them to go back and make those up. But we raised red flags all along that there was a lot of detail and a lot of impacts that this legislation was going to create, a lot of ripples that were not taken into account. And so one of those was the impact on graduation rates. I think we've actually settled at a good place on it. So I wouldn't characterize that as punitive. We're not trying to punish districts because they're taking advantage of this, but we do run into federal law, federal regulations when it comes to the calculation of graduation rates that the Kentucky legislature doesn't have the authority to overturn. So I think Rhonda and her team have come up with a good solution to say, if we have a district that's pitched into a lower performance category because of this issue, then we can appeal, look at that specific issue, and actually move the district back into the other ranking. So we've looked at a bunch of different solutions for how we might solve that problem. We only needed one that would work, and I think we're gonna keep verifying this and working on it, and getting your feedback on it today is part of that. But we think we've got a workable solution on that problem. The other elements that are in the department's guidance really are to anticipate problems that will come if you have a student that takes advantage of this, stays back a year, and then you let them take a slew of new classes and they keep accumulating credits, and all of a sudden they think they're a junior, but they've accumulated enough credits to graduate. The law doesn't waive that provision that says once a student accumulates enough credits to graduate, you issue them a diploma. So the law didn't remove that portion. So that was what we were trying to anticipate, that if districts approach this with sort of let everybody do whatever they want, it will lead to some consequences down the road that we wanted to make sure were raised up. Now, the department doesn't have any regulatory authority here. So what we've issued is non-regulatory guidance. So we've tried to think through what are some of the problems that you can anticipate. Here's how we recommend you handle them. But honestly, a district could take that guidance and ignore it if you want to, and it would be up to courts or if someone were to bring a suit against you because of some outcome that this created, that's where it would be settled. So I'm not coming in, the department's not coming in, the state board isn't promulgating any regulations on this. What we've tried to do is just issue non-regulatory guidance to try and avoid some of the pitfalls that we could see as this progressed on. I'll turn things over to Meredith and Chuck now to clean up on some of the things I've said, and also if Rhonda has any more to add on that
well, just
process.
Real quick, thank you.
Go ahead,
Mark. Thank you for that clarification, Commissioner. I really do appreciate it. And again, I'm not trying to be negative at all. And I know the situation and the spot that you all were put in. There are so many unintended consequences that the legislature did not see when they passed this, and we completely understand that. I think again that my question was really more about this idea of not the seniors, but so much the freshmen, sophomores, juniors. If they come back and take a class, if they do elect to do this supplemental year, in our policymaking process, do we have the ability to grant elective credit for courses that they complete? So, if for instance, Algebra 2 is taken twice, once it gets a D and once it gets a B, could you give the math credit once and then another elective credit? Those are the things I'm trying to ask about just in terms of policymaking. And I'll shut up. I apologize. Thank you.
Sure. No, we appreciate the depth of that question. And oftentimes it makes a difference. Are we running into a state statute, or are we running into a regulation, or are we running into an area where there is no statute, no regulation, and it's in your district policies or practices? So depending on where the barrier we're running into falls, that has a lot of bearing on how much flexibility exists. So Chuck, Meredith, let's let you jump in and see if we can answer the specific question Mark has about that repeating year and then offering an elective credit or an additional credit. That'd be great if we could answer that now. If not, let's go back and research that some and see if we can provide an answer to Mark and this whole group.
Sure. So one thing I do want to just make sure, and just to clarify, and I don't know that is exactly what you were referencing, but with the grades, if a student were to repeat a course, if they have not graduated yet, that is a local decision that a local school board could develop a policy to allow a higher grade to replace a lower grade, and for that positive impact to occur within the GPA. They're allowed to do that, and we do have representatives in our Infinite Campus support team that can help with how that would be coded on transcripts and things like that. So we can honor that extra work and that improvement in their grade that way. As far as the credits, there are certain courses that are required for graduation. And so that's really where there's less flexibility. So if they were to take the same math course twice, that wouldn't satisfy the required for math credits. However, they could have that elective credit. So they would need to take 4 distinct math courses to satisfy that requirement. So that's where, and I think that example is one that will come up a lot, where we have had some students who have struggled with their math coursework virtually. And so we do want them, of course, to reach a mastery level understanding of that math content before they progress to the next course. So the bill does specify that each local school board can develop policies around how this program is implemented. So that flexibility is available. Chuck, what would you add?
Well, I was going to say, and we have gotten, I have heard that word used several times, punitive, and I understand that. It's not meant to be punitive. I think when we were developing our guidance, I think to the point you made is that, yeah, it was a 2-page bill. It didn't have a whole lot of specifics in it. And sort of our intent was to help avoid some of those unintended consequences for students and districts that they try to do something, but the bill didn't suspend any statutes. So we just sort of have to reiterate, all of these other statutory requirements are still there, and we have no way of getting around them. And also, you know, the federal requirements, both on the graduation requirements, the accountability indexes, and all of the IDEA, gifted and talented, all those federal requirements, we have no ability to waive those at all. The one, ironically, the one of the very few specifics in the bill was that you cannot get credit for the same course twice unless you failed the course, in which case you wouldn't have gotten the credit the first time. So that was one of the very few things that the legislature specifically wrote into the bill. So, you know, our hands are really tied on that one. In terms of flexibility, I would say that, again, when districts submit their assurance document, their plan, there is the ability to request a waiver of any administrative regulation. So that is, you know, something set by the Board of Education and the Department of Education. And I'll be honest, since the bill passed, I have not heard anything from any district hinting at a specific waiver that they were going to be looking for. So obviously we would be happy to discuss those and work out to sort of give you some guidance on sort of whether we think that would be an acceptable waiver that the Board of Education would be likely to grant. And we are very happy to talk with districts as you work out your implementation plan. And we've worked with a number of districts who have called or emailed about that. But again, we want to work with you. We just want to make sure that when students make this decision, when districts make this decision, that you know what you're doing, that students will be able to maximize their benefits and their career and college readiness, rather than 3 years down the line get into a situation where I didn't know that that was going to be the case, and now I regret making that decision. So that was a great question. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great question. We appreciate that. And I'll just stress again that what we provide in this case is non-regulatory guidance. So it's sort of our professional opinion about what we think this means and how it will play out. But we don't have authority over this. So we've tried to anticipate what we think are going to be problems or challenges or interpretations and put those forward. But there are professional opinions, my professional opinion, the staff professional opinion on what we think that means. So you're welcome to consult with your own attorneys and reach your own conclusions on that as well. I know Scott Hawkins has his hand up, so Scott, go ahead with your question or thought.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I certainly appreciate what Mark was saying. I think part of the issue is that it would have been nice to maybe have a conversation like this with some superintendents before the guidance document came out. Because when it came out and it basically said kids are going to have to repeat everything, we understand about the graduation requirements, and if they complete all that, we had already had multiple conversations about what are we going to hold till the 5th year so that they don't graduate. And I think that really created a lot of the confusion. Was basically KDE's coming out saying they got to repeat it all. And my first thought, because I called and talked to Mickey, and I said, Mickey, if a person made an A in a class, why are they repeating a class? They ought to be able to move on. And so I think that's where I think we got a little frustrated, and I think that's where kind of the punitive maybe is might be a little strong, but in some ways it seemed punitive to kids if you're trying to do something that is a benefit to them, not making them repeat a course where they did well, but still allowing us to navigate not getting to the graduation piece at the end of that 4th year and holding something to that 5th year. And so I think that's where some conversation on the front end might have eliminated some of this. And so just more a suggestion, I think, moving forward, when we have something like that, it might be good to pull this group together because we're an advisory committee and we can maybe provide some insight that could help shape that guidance that goes out. So
Yeah.
Just a thought there.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I appreciate that point. I think on the larger question of, can we seek this sort of counsel ahead of important guidance is a great point that I'll take away from this. On the specific point of this issue with the repeating or supplementing and what that means, I actually don't think that further consultation would have helped because I've read what's in the statute, I've read what's in our guidance, I've heard from superintendents what they think I mean, and I think honestly it's a professional disagreement of opinion. When I read the statute and it says to repeat or supplement, and I've then talked to superintendents who think that means that a student can take anything that they want, I don't read it that way. So that's not my interpretation of what the statute says. So that interpretation is what's in our guidance, that repeat or supplement means something very specific. I know some superintendents have interpreted that to mean a student should be able to take whatever that they want. Again, our guidance is non-regulatory, so you're welcome to make any interpretation of it and arrange it in your district however you want. But I think on the larger question, it's sage advice that we get input as we work to issue guidance. But on this specific point, I think we're at a disagreement of professional opinion. And I respect where some superintendents are coming from on this. They want to provide every opportunity they can for their students. So I respect and appreciate the intent behind that. But when we look at the plain language of the law and it says repeat or supplement, to me, that has a very specific meaning. So I don't know if Chuck or Meredith, you want to weigh in on that specific point. But I think just on the larger question of getting guidance, getting input on the guidance, that's something that we can take away as advice from this council, and we'll work to do that. I know there was a huge time pressure on this issue because we had all these deadlines that were written into the statute around when this had to happen. So we were scrambling to pull together guidance as we were hearing from school districts. What does this mean? How do we do this? But I think it would have been a prudent step for us to hear from our superintendents in the state what they think about this, how they think it should go. Although, again, in this specific case, I'm not sure that I would have come around to the place some of our superintendents are on what the statute means.
And I will say that as far as I know, this is a unique program among all 50 states. Nobody else has done this. So we were sort of scrambling to develop the guidance, and we've certainly used this as a learning experience. And I think you are not the first one, Superintendent Hawkins, to say that prior consultation with superintendents and other groups would have been useful, and we have definitely taken that to heart. In fact, when we start talking about House Bill 563, I think that's going to be a key element of what we do going forward.
So the only thing that I would add is just to reiterate what we've shared in previous webcasts, that ultimately it is a local decision at how this program will be implemented and what that plan will look like. Our responsibility at the department is just to ensure that there's full compliance with all laws that are in place, and we want to be sure that we are helping to protect districts from any issues that may occur from that implementation. And again, you'll find in those assurance statements there is a lot of flexibility. However, some things are non-negotiable. So there's certain things that we need to be sure are in place. And I imagine that some of our districts will have very different plans than others, and we'll have continued conversation about kind of how this unfolds. But ultimately, it is up to the local school board to review the plans and decide what access students have to courses, what it looks like to be a participant in this program. And we really did want to make sure that districts had that flexibility.
Great, thanks for the question and the advice or direction, Scott. I think going forward, we've got the 1 year that we have to manage the implementation of this, but we're going to have multiple years of impacts and questions that come up in relation to athletics and special education as two prime examples, in addition to questions around credit accumulation and GPAs and what that means for class ranks. So we're likely to have several years of sort of impacts to manage from this going forward. So this won't be the last time that we have to talk about 128 and sort out the impacts of it. But again, I go back to the intent of the law. It was created to try and allow students who missed out on some great experiences this past year to have a shot at those. So I respect that, and that's I think where we have to start in thinking about how we can offer those to students. If there are no other questions on 128, let's go ahead and move to 563. So I'll just pause a minute, and if anybody has a question or a comment or something they'd like to raise on 128.
This may be an even shorter presentation from us, but a longer Q&A portion, because I'll be frank, we have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers at this point. So this will be a short presentation on what we do know. So next slide, please.
So as Dr. Glass mentioned at the start of our conversation, the KDE is not responsible for identification of or support for the account granting organizations and the education opportunity accounts. So any inquiries about those two elements should be directed to Jessica Honiken at the Department of Revenue, and her phone number is there. And we have received several inquiries, and we've directed them to the Department of Revenue, and I know they are still figuring out a lot of things as well. So I'm not sure that by calling that number, anyone's going to get any answers that satisfy them at this point, but that is what we've been instructed to let you know, that is the person to speak to.
Meredith, if I may interject, this is the one part of the bill that we were thrilled with, is that the Department of Revenue was regulating this portion of it.
Yeah, we were told specifically stay out of this, and we were happy to do so. Next slide, please. All right, so this is going to go back to the public school choice and what they're calling open borders. So as part of that, by November 1st, KDE is directed to submit a report to the Legislative Research Commission and specifically their Committee on Education to basically come up with some options on how the local funds would essentially flow. And there are obviously constitutional legal issues there. There are issues in terms of how that would be calculated and how those funds would flow. But that is what KDE will be doing between now and November 1st, is sort of, if for those students who live in one district but attend another district, how should the funds follow the student? House Bill 563 specifies that the state SEEK funding will follow the student from one district to the other, but it does not specify on how the local funds would flow, and that is what KDE will be working on. And as Dr. Glass said earlier, we fully expect this to be litigated because somebody surely will not be happy with how this is done.
So 563 does state that all districts must have a non-resident pupil policy in place by 2022-23 school year. And the parameters of that policy are defined by the local school district. So the policy needs to be in place, but what is in the policy is up to that local school district to determine. Our guidance at this point has been to proceed with development of that policy so that it is ready if the law is to remain in place. However, if 563 is litigated, then this portion would be included in any action that were to take place. Okay, next. I think that might actually be the end of the slides. All right.
Dr. Glatz, any thoughts on this?
Lots, but I'm going to restrain myself on this whole thing. But I think that it would be good to hear from our district partners what they're thinking about these non-resident policies and how those would be constructed. If we've got districts that, I know we have districts that already, several of our districts already have these. What are some elements of those that you think we need to be lifting up and highlighting as in guidance around these that should be included going forward? I know that there are questions around how we handle the preferences of students out of district seeking to enroll in another district's programs. And how the sort of weighting of that occurs. If there's any advice that you have for us on how we should go back to the legislature and think here are some constructive changes that could be made to this to make it better. And then one of the elements that we think is going to be very controversial is that recommendation that we are going to have to craft around how we also move the local portion of funds in addition to SEEK, what ideas you may have around that to really make that sort of concept of a backpack of funding following the student to wherever they enroll. So lots to unpack here on the public school choice side. Certainly lots to unpack on the private school or the tax credit side as well. Just open it up to you for your thoughts and feedback. Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Hey, Chuck, I just had a question for you. Such an odd pairing of, open borders and scholarship tax credits in the same bill. Any reason why that is?
Careful here, Chuck. Careful.
I know the answer. I know the answer, Chuck. Don't worry about it.
The legislature is a black box. Honestly, I think it was. This is how we call these Christmas tree bills. There's something for some people, something for other people. And especially when things pass in the waning days of the legislature, they mix and match things, elements to get people to vote, to get them to the vote count that they need. And as you all know, they overrode the governor's veto in the House by 1 vote. So every little element was necessary, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's the most direct answer. This is the political calculus that it took to get this over the finish line. So they kept seeking what is the combination of public school choice and private school choice policies, sweetening the deal with kindergarten funding and holding that out to try and get to that number that would eventually pass it. And honestly, that proved to be an effective strategy, understanding that even though there's a supermajority of Republicans in the legislature, there are a lot of pro-public school Republicans that are in the legislature that they needed, the party needed to bring along for this as well. So they were able to divide communities, divide superintendents when it came to the public and the public school choice element. I think there are lots of districts that were trying to think about, would we be winners or losers in sort of an open borders configuration, and then that helped them accumulate enough votes to get this to the 51 that they needed. So I think Superintendent Polio, it was pure political calculus about how this came together.
And I apologize for putting you on the spot for that, Chuck. I know that was a tough question, but I note that for the superintendents, all of us on this call, that's the strategy was clearly to divide the superintendents. And I believe this. We have to all consider what's best for public school education across the entire Commonwealth in any decision we make and stand together. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. I see, Scott, you have your hand up. Go right ahead.
I know you'll probably get tired of hearing from me, but I think most all of us have non-resident agreements with a lot of districts around us. Most of them we're able to set conditions. We're going to look at a student's attendance in the other district, or their grades, or their discipline. Am I understanding correctly that we're not allowed to do that moving forward in this? And if so, I can't imagine there's going to be a whole lot of us that are going to have non-resident contracts anymore. So it may end up being the exact opposite of what they wanted when it's all said and done. So is that the way that it's written? Is that we can't set criteria for who we accept that is a non-resident of our school district?
This is where I put on my not an attorney hat, because I would assume that this is probably the part that if there are no changes made in the next legislative session before this actually goes into implementation phase, I assume there will be some school district or some parent that will probably litigate over this. But it all comes down to, what does the word discriminate mean? That's going to be at the heart of it. And just to use, I'm going to pick on you and Mark because you two have both asked questions now, and because you're neighboring districts. Yes, the way it works right now, you may have a reciprocal agreement and you can set the conditions for which students can move between districts, and you can limit the number. You can do whatever you want, and you both have to agree on that. However, going forward, you could completely open your borders and say, any kid from Franklin County who wants to come here, come on, we'll take you. And there's nothing that Mark or his board could really do to stop that. Now the question, but the counter argument is, he could do the same thing and take any of your kids, and you may not have any idea who will be a winner and who will be a loser on that front. The bigger question may be, quite simply, again, what does discriminate mean? And so we are absolutely unsure, and this is where the lawyers will get involved, I'm sure at some point, which is where I will take a step back gladly, does that mean that you can limit who comes into your district to only students who got a 3.0 or had a certain grade threshold? Does it mean that you can only take students from Franklin County, but you'll say we're not accepting students from Anderson County? Quite honestly, I do not know. And the bill, and thank you for bringing that up in the screen. This language right here, this one paragraph, is about the extent of it. And I would point out that the bill says, the law says, you have to file your policy with the Department of Education. It does not give us the ability to give a thumbs down to this. It does not give us a whole lot of power to accept or deny any of these policies. We're going to be holding on to them sort of for record keeping purposes. So that, I think, is why, Dr. Glass was saying earlier, we're looking for input so that we can sort of give feedback to the legislature in terms of how they may want to adjust this bill, because I think there was a recognition, and I had one legislator specifically tell me, we're going to pass this bill so that you guys will be forced to come to the table and sort of clean it up next year, to the extent that it needs to be cleaned up, or some superintendents want it to be cleaned up. I have no doubts that there will be some among the 171 of you who are completely happy with the way it is and will let everything sort out the way it does through the court system or however else later. But that is sort of where we stand at this point. That may have been a long and rambling answer to your question, but that's sort of what we have at this moment.
Yeah, Chuck, and I'd add that most of you know that when this was in the legislature, I spoke out against it and I called it half-baked legislation. And this, when I said half-baked, this is the provision that I was referring to. There are so many questions that this leaves unanswered that right now I think it's not workable. Because if you just go forward and say, well, you may not discriminate between, does that mean that, Scott, if you decide to open a STEM school in your district, that you have to treat the students that are outside your district on the same basis that you do students that are within your own community? Does it mean that? Does it? Those are the sorts of questions that I've wondered about. And typically when even in places where you have this sort of open public school choice, there's still some discrimination of students where you have students who live within a boundary of a school have a preference. Students who have a sibling that attend the school have a preference. Students who have a parent who works at the school, they have a preference. Then students who are in the district have a preference, and then students who are outside the district have a preference. So there is sort of an ordering of who gets in. The bill does talk about that. That schools can limit based on enrollment capacity, but that's obscure too. If you have an old building that has maybe a lot of square footage, but some of it's not usable for instructional purposes, how do we calculate that? How do we determine what the enrollment capacity is? Even if your building has the enrollment capacity, but for funding reasons, you lag the staffing capacity to handle an infusion of new students, that's complicated as well. So I was concerned and remain concerned about this element of the bill and how we actually implement this. It's one of the things that I think we're going to have to work on trying to clarify, perhaps get the legislature to clean this up and provide more direction for us on how it operates. Otherwise, I do think we're going to end up with the courts deciding what this means.
Do you anticipate any impact on limited guardians? And the way that's played out in the past, will that change?
That is a question that I have not been asked before. We'll have to do some research on that one because I'm not sure what is currently in statute regarding that and how that may or may not conflict with this. I'll say the other question we have gotten is students who are the children of district employees who may live in another district. That's already in statute. It continues to be in statute, but we're not sure how that conflicts with the policy shall not discriminate between non-resident pupils. So.
Right. So, Chuck, if you can follow up on that first part of that question, see if we can research that some. I see we've got Trey with his hand up and then Matt. So, Trey, go right ahead. Trey, are you on?
May still be muted. There, yes.
There we go.
One of my big concerns, and it has been for some time, and I voiced this concern last year as we began looking at the virtual school options and virtual schools, is that, you're not only going to have counties that lay next to each other and potential disagreements or discord, but you could have a student in Fulton County attending school in Pike County. And that's another thing. And so we're going to be in competition if we're not careful with each other over students from across the state because we may lose students to our neighboring counties and districts. So I'm with Mr. Polio. We've got to come together as a collective group and have some genuine discussions on this and understand the ramifications from across the state. And I'll just add this, the next thing that's coming, guys, is a push to the High School Athletics Association to get rid of the residency rule, because what parents are going to claim is I don't have free choice education if you're going to limit my child's participation in extracurricular. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, Trey, I think you're absolutely right. We should expect some kind of statewide virtual school model to pop up. Some district is going to create that because they're going to see it as a way to enroll students from across the state who want a virtual option. Their district may or may not be allowing it, or they may feel that they can provide something that another district is not. But I think that's to be expected, that something like that's coming.
Would also point out on the athletics side of things that there is a part of the bill of House Bill 563 that says any student who transfers enrollment from a district of residence to a non-resident district shall be ineligible to participate in interscholastic athletics for 1 calendar year from the date of the transfer. Now, of course, that does not only refer to high school students. So what you may end up seeing is students transferring at an earlier date so that when they do get to high school or middle school or whatever year that they want to really focus on athletics, that you could see those transfers happening earlier and earlier for athletics purposes to avoid that particular language.
So I see that Matt has his hand up. Matt, go ahead.
Yes, Commissioner, I was curious if there is another state that has tackled this whole concept of open borders and done it in a I guess, a representative way that we would all maybe agree is good or a good outcome with that. So it's new to Kentucky, obviously. I know in Indiana, it's been a fiasco over there where you have literally school buses that are going into another county to pick up children to bring them back across to the other county. And I agree totally with what you have said, Commissioner. I think this is a complete Pandora's box. Now, in Owensboro, Davis County, we've had open border here for many, many years. And even with the counties surrounding us, that's not been an issue. We have open contracts that allow kids to move. But one of the things that hasn't occurred is the offset with local tax, local property taxes collected. It's all been, state seat dollars that have flowed. So when we add that complexity to it, which I think would have to be done on a statewide basis, I don't see how this ends up anywhere but in a court of law, because all of a sudden you have taxpayers in one county that is subsidizing education for students in another county, and it goes both ways. I just see this completely fraught with having a statewide solution to answer these questions. And then secondly, for communities that have not had this, you can see cherry picking going on with students, leaving one district with the most difficult, hardest to educate. Let's just say that. No, those are probably not very politically correct terms, but we all know what that means. And those to educate those children tends to be a whole lot more expensive when it comes to certain demographics. So I just see this as being really Pandora's box, that once we open it, I'm not sure that there are answers that are navigable and negotiable between all the parties involved.
Well, excellent points on all fronts. There are other states that have had open border or backpack funding models in place for several years. I worked in Iowa and in Colorado. Colorado had a very aggressive form of this. It's been in place for a couple of decades. I wouldn't, so even though they've had it for a couple of years and I worked in that system, I wouldn't say that it had all the kinks worked out. All of the problems that you're raising will come. Where you have students who are affluent and have means, their families are the ones who typically take advantage of the choice options. And so you end up with poor districts that become poorer, the resources become thinner in those districts, and there's an increased concentration of poverty within districts and even within schools. I have seen some in the district where I worked before coming back to Kentucky. In Jeffco, we were a net importer of students. So we had more students enrolling into our district than out, but I know it devastated some of the communities that were near Jeffco Public Schools in a way that they will never recover from. And then also, even within the district where I worked, some schools and communities, because parents could enroll their student into any school that they wanted to, you saw the same effect. Schools that were in higher poverty, more immigrants, more English language learners, that became even more concentrated, and it exacerbated the equity problems that we have. So I think that's going to be a consequence of this. You will, I think, see, and if you were at the KASS conference a couple of weeks ago, I talked some about this. There will be some innovations that this create, because it will cause, some of you will look at your education systems and you think, I'm going to create a specialized education program as a way to sort of enter into the market and attract and retain my segment of the market share. So it will lead to different school models, some of which Trey talked about as a negative. You're going to have somebody that comes forth with a virtual school model as a way to sort of try and pull students from across the state. But there are significant transportation questions that you have raised. There are special education cost issues that need to be thought through. And so going back to what I talked about this earlier, this legislation that we have was not well thought through. I called it half-baked, and I stand by that. We can, I think, learn from places and other states who have done this for a while, mostly to learn from their mistakes and think about how we can build in some safeguards that protect equity, that protect services for kids with disabilities, that clarify some of the athletics and some of the transportation questions that we know are going to come up, that we can think those through. But that's not what we did with this bill. We're going to be figuring that out on the fly or solving it in court. But I think all of the questions that you and Trey have raised, and Scott too, and Marty, all of these things are challenges that we're going to have with the implementation of this public school choice provision.
Just add another comment to that. My fear is because, I have a number in my mind of districts, superintendents and boards that supported this aspect of 563, but that was certainly the minority. At least that's my takeaway from that. So here we have a minority that was supportive of a bill that's going to change a majority in a community like ours that has done quite well without the need of such legislation. But it's going to be the tail that literally wags the dog. So that's my number one point I wanted to mention. Secondly, there's this sort of prevailing thought that competition among schools breeds success. And that philosophy is really becoming now policy, that if we can pit school districts against each other or schools against each other, that the business side of competition makes schools better. And I completely disagree with that. I don't think that works well in the school model, but yet that's the philosophy that policy is now being exacted upon.
Well, I think you're preaching to the choir, sir, with this group. I think we can expect, just given the political landscape that we have in the state. I also haven't seen places where these policies have been acted that they ever are put back in the box. So the private school tax credits, those are probably going to expand. The provisions around public school, inter-district and intra-district school choice are probably going to be ironed out and expanded. And somebody at some point is going to start opening charter schools, and states are going to have that dynamic as well. So one of the things that I talked about a couple of weeks ago is that one of the things that we can do as public school leaders is start to think about how we get in front of that, how we work to stabilize and secure the market shares of student enrollment. And I know that, as you said, Matt, it's alien to us to think about school enrollment from that lens as it's a market. But that's what all these provisions are designed to do, is to create a market for school choice and to have schools compete, innovate, and work to attract enrollment. We also know that markets don't care about equity. They don't. And so that is the challenge that I wish had been built into this. And maybe going forward, that's a place where we can do work, is how do we have school choice in all of the forms that the legislature has created in Kentucky now, but how do we also make sure that districts are not, and schools are not cherry picking or excluding certain students, that there's really is an opportunity for a student to attend any school that is right for them. That's complicated, but that's the lens that I'd love for us to have with this going forward, is how do we bring equity back into this conversation? Because this law as it's written right now, both with the public school and the private school choice, are going to exacerbate the inequities that we have.
2 points that I might bring up, because I did a webcast with a lot of DPPs a couple of weeks ago, and we mentioned this, and I'll mention it again. Keep in mind that we expect House Bill 563 to be litigated, if only on the education opportunity account side. And so it is entirely possible that the Supreme Court or a lower court could issue an injunction or throw out the bill entirely. And if that happens, again, not an attorney, I would probably, if I were a school board member, want to have a reciprocal agreement in place for 22-23 in case this does not happen. Because if you don't have a reciprocal agreement and this bill is not in place, students are stuck with their their resident district. And so that would be a huge dislocation for a number of students. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, I think, going forward. Again, we have no inside knowledge of any litigation in particular, but we keep hearing through the grapevine like everybody else does.
Just one final point I would add, and again, welcome any other feedback or thoughts that you might have on this issue. The pivot that the department and I have to make now is to one of implementation. So this is now law in the state, and so I, as the commissioner of the department, we have an obligation to try and take this and make it work. And so that's what we're going to do. I don't want that to be construed that all of a sudden I'm 1,000% supportive of this. I'm not, and I've said that all along. But we will try to take this legislation. The legislature has spoken. We went through all the process, and it's the law of the land. So we're going to try to make it the best that we can. But I think going forward, there are changes to it that we'll work to enact on both sides of this to try and make it bring the equity back into it, to bring the fairness back into it, and to eliminate some of the corrupt practices that you will see in any unregulated market. You start to see corruption take place, gaming, skimming of only certain students, exclusion of certain students. So if we really want to have a fair, transparent school choice system, then we have to bring that equity lens back into it. David, thank you. Go right ahead.
Can you or Chuck bring us up to speed a little bit more about what might be expected out of this task force for funding mechanisms?
Not really sure just yet. Actually, I finally got word today because I've been bugging the speaker and the president in terms of when are we going to get appointments and a meeting schedule. And so we do not anticipate to hear who will be appointed to run the task force until early June. And so we're not sure what the meeting schedule will look like, but we would anticipate, or at least I'm certainly pushing them in that direction as much as possible, to look at not just SEEK, but also sort of local revenue sources, what local districts can and cannot do to raise local funds, and how that fits into the SEEK formula. Facilities funding, career and technical education, and how those programs are funded, because we all know that there's a huge differential between the haves, the have-nots, the have-somes, the have-mores. And so I'm hopeful that we will look at school funding from soup to nuts, that it's not going to be just a SEEK formula question. It will be the entire gamut of how local districts are funded, how KDE operates as a pass-through entity for those funding, how it's all calculated, everything involved in that. And I would remind everyone that there will be 3 superintendents who sit on that school funding task force, including one from an independent school district. There will also be 3 local school board members who will be on that task force, as well as Dr. Glass or whomever he designates to sit there. So I know that's not really an answer, but that's what we're going to try to get out of it. I've seen a lot of task forces in Frankfurt that have not really gotten a whole lot accomplished, except a lot of conversation, but hopefully, this will be different.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. So I think we've beaten on this topic probably enough. The thing that I would leave you with, just from someone who's had some experience working in these systems, that I would say is that in Colorado, where I spent most of my career, the charter schools got really out early on creating specialized school models that were different than what the public schools were offering. And by doing so, they attracted large swaths of the enrollment, to the point now that about 20% of the kids in Colorado are enrolled in a charter school. I think it took years for the public schools to catch up to that, that they just did not see it from that competitive market lens, that you've got to do something to secure your part of the marketplace. So that's what I would put forth as what I'd ask superintendents in Kentucky to start thinking about, is this is coming and the options are coming, and people are going to start seeing it like a market and start trying to create school options that will attract students from other districts. And so the sooner you can start wrapping your head around that and thinking about how can you create something that your community, your families, your students are excited about, that will secure the market, that's the school choice market in your community, whatever that looks like in your community, the better off you're going to be. Okay, let's, so I think, oh, Trey, go right ahead.
One question to that, your experience in Colorado, did those schools, the charter schools, the private schools, did they have a level playing field with the public schools? Because that's part of the problem is the legislation that we're bound by versus maybe a private institution or a charter institution not being. And so to be competitive with them is a huge lift.
Yeah, Colorado did not have private school choice. So this provision around the tax credits that we have in Kentucky, we never had to contend with that. And I don't think they will going forward. But certainly on the charter school side, early on, we saw charter schools do things that were exclusionary. So they would say you have to volunteer so many hours a week at the school, or there's a foundation and there's a donation required to the foundation, or they would subtly discourage students with disabilities from enrolling and saying, you know, we're really not set up to handle that here. You should go back to the public school system and do that. So there were elements of that that were in place. And honestly, there were some charter schools that were created in communities as a way to sort of handle white flight. So you'd have a school and they would call it an academy, and it would have a very traditional instructional model. They would offer no free or reduced lunch. They would offer no transportation services, and then they would have these provisions around volunteer requirements, things like that. So who you ended up enrolling in those was mostly white affluent parents. And then they put in place sibling preferences in their lottery, so you would have all these generations of the same families going through where it really wasn't open. So when I talk about that, if we could go back with this bill, and I think the political writing is on the wall, we're going to have expanded school choice in Kentucky. If I could go back with this bill, I would say think about those mistakes that other states learned as they implemented this, and build in ways to try and lift up the equity, like to say you have to offer a free reduced lunch program. You have to offer transportation to the students that are within your own district. So some provisions like that. You have to accept students with disabilities and work with the school district on the plan to support that student. You have to create lottery practices, if you're using a lottery, that result in a representative student body. So we've seen schools and districts use things like zip codes or different geographic areas of communities and say we will proportionally enroll kids from different parts of the community so that the charter school or the school of choice, whatever it may be, looks like the rest of the community. So these are all practices that have evolved over the past few decades in states all over the country as a way to sort of undo the unregulated approach a lot of states went into this with. I'm concerned that because Kentucky's law is so wide open and undefined, we're going to repeat those same mistakes.
We did get a question in the chat that I am not qualified to answer, so I'll defer to whoever can, from Greg Schultz. Any discussion about COVID reporting during summer school activities? Is there still a requirement for daily reporting like we are currently under? I don't know if Dr. Foster or anybody on her staff is in this, or anybody. Do we have anybody from KD who can answer that?
We may have to, well, I think we've subtly transitioned into the open discussion portion of the program too, Chuck. So that's good. That's good. I think we had exhausted our thoughts on 563, but lots of work to do still ahead on that. I think Kelly was on earlier. I don't see her now, but if she's not on, we'll take this and go back, and this may be a public health question that we need to get answered and circle back to everybody on. But on that note, and sorry, Greg, I wish that we were able to answer that straight away. Just any other feedback? The floor is really open for what you want to talk about or advise me and the department on. So we're really grateful to have this group of experienced superintendents to provide feedback to us. So the floor is open, folks. Yeah, Matt, go right ahead. Thank you.
Just looking at in terms of school for next year, school in August, and I know these are crystal ball kinds of questions. Understand that. The first question I would ask, it's probably the one that maybe we can deal with the most here, is the department taken a position in terms of the requirement to have a virtual academy next school year? Where do you see that?
Yeah, we haven't taken the position of requiring anybody to do anything on it. What we have tried to do is recognize that there were some challenges in the funding model around virtual school that related to ADA calculations and that it didn't extend to elementary grades, the model that we had in place. So that was that whole waiver option that we actually have 109 districts requesting that waiver out of the regular calculation of ADA for virtual students. So we expect that to be used for next year. Going forward, I think we will look at a change in the regulatory framework so we don't have to keep doing waivers every year. So it's just a path that districts have available if you want to do this. But I think this is one of those things emerging from the COVID experience. Hybrid schooling, virtual schooling, less sort of direct student contact time and more self-directed student work out in communities or independently. I think those are some things that are going to stick in several communities. And so we're going to have to change our thinking around attendance and grading and school enrollment in ways that reflect what our students and our families are asking for. And what I think, honestly, several of our schools had success with this past year. I mentioned I was in Shelby County last week, and Superintendent Sugg there was talking about they really had a lot of success with basically a 4-day week. And the last day of the week was students working on projects, students getting individual support, students learning out in the community. But now where there was this huge pressure on her to restore the system that she had in place before, even though the students and the staff felt like they had arrived at a better configuration. So that's one thing that she was struggling through. How does she manage not just the ADA requirements around that, but how does she also manage the parent expectations of restoring school as we knew it before?
Thank you.
Dr. Glass, if we don't have any other questions, and certainly want to leave the floor open for discussion, but I just wanted to reiterate or perhaps clarify, all districts will need to submit their supplemental school year plan status via GMAP. So even if your local school board has elected to not participate, you will need to go into that GMAP form. There's a box at the top. We are not participating, check that, submit, perfect. If your district is, then you'll go through and do the assurances. I just wanted to clarify that all districts will need to take some action to indicate their status.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. I see we have another question from Greg about the 3-foot, 6-foot quarantining. Again, Kelly, I think had to drop off, or she would be our point person. We have a weekly meeting with public health where we really look to their guidance on elements around quarantining and masking requirements. Oh, here looks like Natasha has something in here that you can read. But I think whatever we have now, really for the next couple of weeks as we get through school, I think if you've got procedures that are working in your community, finish it out. And then when we get back for next school year, I think it's safe to assume that we're going to have fewer restrictions that we do now. But I would hesitate or be slow to guess what I think those will be. I think things may change even over the summer, probably bending toward opening up more and reducing restrictions, but who knows? I think, if you'd asked us this time last year, would we be having this conversation right now this year, we would not have thought that we would. We couldn't wrap our heads around that we'd be dealing with COVID mitigation for over a year now. Yeah, so there's you can see Natasha's response from Robin Kinney. Well, seeing or hearing no more questions, we'll go ahead and call this meeting to bring it to a close. I want to express my appreciation for all of you being on with us and also for asking really direct and honest questions and giving us direct and honest feedback. I think a few years ago I read that great book, Fierce Conversations. It really urges people to get to it and say what needs to be said and have the direct and honest conversation that needs to be had. So I believe in that and appreciate it as well. I also want to express my appreciation to Deanna, Greg, and Scott. I know that the three of you are retiring this year. We're going to miss you as education leaders in Kentucky, and certainly miss you on this group. But if I know anything about educators, often they fail at retirement. So I'm expecting to see all of you again back in some form as well. We look forward to that. If there are no other thoughts or comments, we'll draw the meeting to a close. All right. Thanks, everybody.